Hey everybody, today we're out here with the 2020 Nissan Rogue Sport. 2020 brings us a refresh but not a redesign of this popular crossover. Now in America, Nissan doesn't tell us how many Rogue Sports they sell versus Nissan Rogues, but we know that this is one of their best-selling crossovers in the world. We know that because the Rogue Sport is not the Rogue Sport in other world markets. It's sold as the Nissan Qashqai, and this is in the top 5 best-selling crossovers in markets like the European Union. The big change for 2020 happens up front, where we get a restyled front end to bring this a little bit more in line with the rest of the Nissan product line. We also get a radar sensor right there behind the Nissan logo because we now have a few more advanced safety features than we had before. The headlamps have been restyled and they now feature LED elements inside, but these are still halogen headlamps, both high beams and low beams. That's because the Rogue Sport is kind of a different vehicle in America than it is worldwide. When it comes to active safety, Nissan's priorities are a little bit different, and I like the blend of features that we find on this a little bit more than some of the base packages we find on the competition. Now, it's worth noting that when you take a look at the side of your screen, one feature that we don't see standard on this is radar adaptive cruise control, even though the radar sensor is actually standard. However, we do get features that we don't find standard on the competition, like the blind spot monitoring system, rear parking sensors, and rear emergency auto braking. Although I really love adaptive cruise control, on my must-have list, I really value the rear parking sensors, that rear emergency braking, and blind spot monitoring just a little bit more than the convenience feature of adaptive cruise control. Because remember, this still has autonomous braking in the front, pedestrian detection, lane keeping assistance, all that other stuff standard. The only thing it's really missing that we do see in some of the competition is that adaptive cruise control in the absolute base model. In the US, the Rogue Sport is not quite a subcompact crossover, but it's not quite a compact crossover either. In Europe, this competes very directly with the Volkswagen Tiguan, but that is the smaller Tiguan, not the model that we get in the US. As you can see at the bottom of your screen, this is significantly shorter overall than something like the Nissan Rogue in America without the Sport, or the American Volkswagen Tiguan, that are definitely on the longer end of the segment. But it's also not as small as something like a Honda HR-V, or of course the Nissan Kicks. The Kicks is what competes very directly with the CHR and HR-V. This is designed to sort of compete with those entries or be a less expensive alternative to something like a Nissan Rogue, the RAV4, or a Honda CR-V. As we look around the Rogue Sport, it's definitely important to keep that competition or lack of competition in mind. Out back, we do have partial LED styling elements here, so we have these LED light pipes, and the rest of the bulbs are incandescent. At the bottom of the bumper, we find well-integrated parking sensors and an exhaust tip tucked up right there under the bumper. The tweener status continues under the hood, where we find just one engine for 2020. It's a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine. It produces 141 horsepower. That is more horsepower than in many of its subcompact competition. It's not too uncommon to find about 120 horsepower under the hood of many subcompact crossovers in America, but this is notably less than we find in the average compact crossover in America, like a RAV4 that starts with 203. In addition to giving you a little bit more power than we find in the average subcompact crossover in America, one of the other reasons you might want to look at the Rogue Sport as an alternative is the availability of all-wheel drive. That's certainly a reason to upgrade from the Nissan Kicks into the Rogue Sport. There are a number of subcompact crossovers in America that simply don't offer all-wheel drive at all. The Kicks is one of them. We also have the Toyota CHR, the new Hyundai Venue, and a few others as well. Now, it's worth noting that even though we get less horsepower than we find in the average compact crossover in America, as you can see down there at the bottom of your screen, fuel economy is not necessarily that much better than the average compact crossover these days. And of course, if you look at the compact crossover segment and you're interested in fuel economy, there are a number of new hybrids available for 2020. Front seat comfort is good, whether we're comparing this to a compact crossover or a subcompact crossover. Nissan has overall some pretty comfortable seat designs, and this is certainly one of them. We also have a 2-way adjustable lumbar support, a feature that we don't always find in the subcompact segment. We also have a tilt telescopic steering column with a pretty decent range of motion. When taking a look at the interior, it's again important to remember that this is not quite the same kind of vehicle as the average subcompact crossover in America. It was designed for other world markets to compete in kind of a different set than it does in America. Hopping into the back seat, even though this is a little bit larger on the outside than some of the subcompact crossovers, oddly enough we find a little bit less legroom on the inside. It just seems to be down to the overall packaging of the Rogue Sport versus some of the subcompact competitors. A lot of that difference seems to be right up there in the hood section, where we do find a larger engine compartment and a slightly longer nose. It's noticeable if I sit right here behind myself at 6 feet tall. I have about 2 inches of legroom left. This is still certainly comfortable for adults in here, but you will find a little bit more room in something like a Honda HR-V, oddly enough. Headroom is very generous back here. I have about 2 inches of headroom left. And because of the relative positioning of this vehicle, we do find a rear seat that is a little bit wider than many subcompact crossovers. So if you're looking for something that's going to be more easy to accommodate 3 people across the back in, this is certainly going to be one of those options. It also is going to be a little bit more accommodating for child seats if you were to need to put, say, 1 child seat and 2 adults back here, or an arrangement of child seats and children. This is certainly going to be a little bit more capable than some of those narrow crossovers in America. The rear seats fold in a 60/40 fashion, and we also have dual air vents in the back. And lastly, a touch that I do appreciate here is that we have a center seat belt that comes out of the seat itself, not out of the ceiling like we do find in some of the competition. Behind the rear hatch, we find just under 23 cubic feet of storage space. That puts this a hair behind the HR-V or entries like the Kia Soul as well. But there's a little bit more to this than meets the eye, because the Rogue Sport is a little bit wider than some of those other options, especially versus something like the Kona or the Kia Soul. And that means that this cargo area's shape is a little bit different. It's a little bit shallower, it's a little bit broader in both directions really, across the back and up the front. You can really tell that with this 22-inch roller bag right here, because if the cargo load floor was in its upright position, I could move it all the way to the back and I would still have what appears to be about 6 or 7 inches between that bag and the end of the cargo area. And in most of the subcompact competition, this bag would be right at the lip of the opening. At first glance, the Rogue Sport's cargo area appears to be very similar to the Nissan Rogue, which is a little bit larger. But these 2 floor sections, although they can be dropped into the floor right like that, they cannot be put on a second level like we see in the regular Rogue. Instead, the system is designed mainly just to drop these 2 sections down there towards the floor. If I can get them right under that part, so that way you could put more cargo in the back. Now, personally, I suspect that I might just leave these either out or at home all the time, because getting them both in there into the cargo area and then down on the floor flat is a little bit tricky. In addition to that, there really isn't much of a disadvantage to leaving these load floor sections out all the time. If we go completely under them, that's where we find a spare tire. And it does appear that if you wanted to put a full-size spare tire under here, then you could do that. But of course, these load floor sections would have to be in their up position all the time. We're going to take a very quick spin around the interior, since essentially nothing has changed for 2020. We have a sunglass holder right here, no moonroof in this model, height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, 2-way adjustable headrests, and these partial cloth seats. You can see that we have cloth inserts right there in the back and on the bottom cushion. There's not too much bolstering on the front seat back or seat bottom cushion, so if you're a larger driver or larger passenger, you might find this interior a little bit more comfortable than some of the competition. Moving over to the front doors, we find a combination of hard and soft touch plastics. There's a soft touch upper section right there, a thickly padded armrest, which is what we've come to expect from Nissan, and then we have storage bins right down there at the bottom of the front doors. You can see there's a bottle holder section right there up front. Now, I do find the overall materials quality to be pretty similar to most of the entries in this segment, but I really like the interior of the Honda HR-V. They've done a good job bringing that interior up market a little bit. Also, the new Hyundai Venue is an excellent entry. The overall dashboard styling is very reminiscent of the larger Nissan Rogue, so not too much of a change there for 2020. Again, all the basic components remain the same. To the left of the screen, we have the start-stop button for the engine, dual zone automatic climate control below that. This is kind of an unusual feature in a vehicle in this price category. Normally, you'd have to step up to something like a CR-V or a RAV4 in order to get that. We have a single USB input right there, 12-volt power port, electric brake hold button right over here, and the electric parking brake. Manual mode is over to the left. We push away from the driver for gear up, pull towards the driver for gear down. Behind that, we have 2 pretty decently sized cup holders, so we're easily able to accommodate large takeout drinks. You can find the heated seat buttons right back there. These do stay on because they're physical switches, so if you turn off the car, turn it back on, they will return to the on position. Center console right there. It's a large storage bin. We have a single USB charge-only port and a 12-volt charge port as well. The instrument cluster isn't quite as snazzy as the one that we find in the Nissan Kicks that does have a larger color LCD, but we still have a color LCD right there in the middle. And we have Nissan's excellent D-shaped steering wheel. You can see we have a flat bottom right there that does make it a little bit sporty looking, but it also makes it a little bit easier for taller people to get in and out of the vehicle because there's a little bit more clearance. Sport grips up top. This one is leather wrapped. We find the controls for that multifunction LCD over here on the left side, along with the volume up, down, track forward, backward button, and then the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control over here on the right side. This button enables and disables the radar adaptive cruise control and will also turn on the more aggressive lane keeping assistance system. Another nice touch if you're looking for some more luxury features in your inexpensive crossover, we have a 2-position seat memory over there on the driver's side. That's something again that we don't typically find in the subcompact segment. Out on the road, the Rogue Sport has not changed since it was first launched in America, so I'm just going to go ahead and put all the same scores we got last time right up there across the top of your screen. We were able to verify the 9.5 second 0 to 60 time in this 2020 production model, so there was no particular funny business going on with that last pre-production model we were driving. As I've said before, the important thing to remember about the Rogue Sport is that very much like other sport-named crossovers in the industry, sport does not mean faster, it does not mean handles better in this context, it simply means smaller. So we see the same sort of thing going on in something like the Outlander Sport versus the Outlander, formerly the Santa Fe versus the Santa Fe Sport. So if you're looking for the fastest entry in this particular segment, that's going to be an entry like the Kona with the optional 1.6 liter turbo, or of course the Kona EV or the Soul EV. Those are the fastest entries that you can buy at this point in time until we see the advent of something like the Hyundai Kona N-Line or N, and it does appear that Hyundai is going to give us an actual sport version of that particular crossover. But instead, the Nissan Rogue Sport has a slightly different mission in mind. And that is obvious out on the road, because this certainly feels like a vehicle that straddles segments, and in that respect it reminds me a great deal of the Jeep Compass. The Compass is also kind of a tweener, because they have the Renegade that is more or less a competitor to something like the Nissan Kicks on the small side of things, and then of course they have the Jeep Cherokee, which is a direct competitor to the Rogue, the RAV4, the CR-V, etc. Hyundai, of course, has two entries in the subcompact crossover segment, but they went the opposite direction and gave us something that's even smaller than the average subcompact entry. On the other hand, if you're looking for bang for the buck, that is exactly where this model comes in, because this definitely feels a little bit larger out on the road than the average subcompact crossover, a little bit closer to something like the compact segment, the CR-V, the RAV4, etc. The obvious exception to that is going to be power, of course. This 2-liter engine just doesn't have the same kind of oomph that we find in the next category up. And as I mentioned before, overall fuel economy is not quite as good as some of the larger crossovers either. Over our week of mixed driving with this particular model, we've been averaging 27.5 mpg. That appears to be a little bit lower than the last time we had the Rogue Sport in for review. We are driving the all-wheel drive version. Again, that is one of the key differences between this and the Nissan Kicks, but the Kicks is certainly going to get you better fuel economy overall. Now, while we're talking about all-wheel drive, it is worth noting that very much like the larger Nissan Rogue, this all-wheel drive system has a lock button right here. I can actually press that button and it will do nothing for me at the moment because I'm going over about 25 miles an hour or so. But if you're looking for the absolute best traction in slippery situations, snow, ice, etc., engaging that all-wheel drive lock feature is definitely going to give you better traction because it forces a complete lock of the center coupling. And it's obvious out on looser surfaces that this is a true full lock of that center coupling because you can definitely feel a little bit of binding in the steering wheel. This is a feature that we don't really find on that many modern crossovers anymore for some reason. A lot of manufacturers have decided to just use software to try and imitate that or give us some of the benefits of a true locking center coupling, but nothing is going to match this in terms of overall actual real-world grip in those sticky situations. It's worth noting that even manufacturers like Subaru do not allow you to command a complete electronic lock of their coupling. As with just about every other aspect of the Rogue Sport, overall on-road feel definitely falls in the middle of this segment overall. This is not as sporty as something like a Mazda CX-3 in terms of the overall steering feel, or the Mazda CX-30, another interesting tweener entry in this particular segment. We also don't have as much power as we find in the CX-30 either. This doesn't have the overall level of grip that we find in the Hyundai Kona, but we get a relatively comfortable and relatively isolated cabin. If you're looking for an inexpensive small crossover to do road trips in, this suspension setup is going to be an awful lot more comfortable than many of the small crossovers in America, simply due to its overall size, the extra weight that we have in here, and the way the suspension has been set up. This definitely soaks up some of the larger imperfections out on the road better than many of the really small crossovers, and because of the longer wheelbase, the suspension definitely has time to settle after the front suspension hits something and then the rear suspension hits something. Crossovers are big business in America, and that's why every manufacturer is pulling out all the stops and bringing us as many different crossovers as we can get. That makes comparisons just a little bit tricky for the Rogue Sport, but let's dive into that now. The most important thing to know about the Rogue Sport is that it falls pretty neatly between two categories. The Nissan Kicks is targeted at folks that are shopping for a Honda HR-V or a Mazda CX-3, something in that subcompact category, whereas the Rogue is targeted directly at the CR-V and the RAV4. Being stuck right between segments means that we find aspects of both. We find an engine that is definitely less powerful than the compact segment, down there with something like the Honda HR-V, but we get rear seat accommodations that are a little bit more like a RAV4 or a CR-V because the rear bench seat is wider. The entire vehicle is notably wider than the average subcompact crossover in America, especially when you're taking a look at some of the very small subcompacts like Nissan's own Kicks, the new Hyundai Venue, or the Mazda CX-3. Because crossovers are such big business in America, being stuck right in the middle is not unique to Nissan. We also have entries like the Jeep Compass, the Outlander Sport, the Kia Seltos, and kind of sort of the Subaru Crosstrack. The Crosstrek is an odd duck here, of course, because it's a compact hatchback that has been priced like a subcompact crossover. When you're taking a look at the price tags that you see right in front of you, it's important to remember that although the Rogue Sport starts at $23,240, which looks an awful lot like the price tag on a base CR-V or RAV4, keep in mind that Nissan's discounts are pretty hefty, and you should expect to get $2,500 to $3,000 off that MSRP when you go to the Nissan dealer. That's one of the tricky things about talking about comparisons in categories that are so close together. MSRP and purchase price are not necessarily the same thing. Something like the RAV4 and the CR-V, they're going to transact much closer to the MSRP, whereas something like the Rogue Sport is definitely going to be several $1,000s less expensive. The most logical competitor is the best-selling one, which is the Jeep Compass. The Jeep Compass and the Kia Soul are the two best-selling utility somethings that are smaller than the average RAV4 or CR-V in America. The Jeep Compass last year sold over 150,000 units. That puts it significantly ahead of most subcompact crossovers in America, and remember, the Jeep Compass isn't alone. We also have the Jeep Renegade, which is smaller. The Compass is the tweener, sitting between the Renegade and the Cherokee. Much like the Nissan Rogue Sport, the Compass does have aspects of the larger category and the smaller category as well. We have a larger interior than we find in the average subcompact crossover, but it's not quite as generously sized as what we would find in a CR-V or, of course, the Jeep Cherokee. Under the hood, the Compass's drivetrain also falls a little bit between worlds. You can get a manual transmission still, it's the base transmission on offer, and interestingly enough, you can get all-wheel drive and a manual transmission if you're looking for. The Compass and the Jeep Crosstrek are two of the only vehicles in America that allow that combination in 2020. Because the ZF 9-speed from the Cherokee is a little bit too expensive, you'll only find that in the Trailhawk version of the Compass. The rest of the line gets a 6-speed Aisin transmission, which is essentially a refreshed version of what we found under the hood of the last generation Toyota Camry, oddly enough. The big thing to know about the Compass is that it's easily going to be the most off-road capable in this segment, mainly because of the way the software has been programmed for the all-wheel drive system. We have a ton of different options available, and it can get pretty expensive. You can get your Jeep Compass up to nearly $34,000. That's a pretty big spread for something that is in this end of the pool. Other high points for the Cherokee are the infotainment system, which I definitely think is more modern than what we find in the Nissan, and I think the interior overall is well crafted. Next up, we have the Subaru Crosstrack, the second best-selling entry in this particular odd little category. The Crosstrack, however, is the oddest in a way because it really is just an Impreza hatchback that has been lifted up. Aside from the extra height and a little bit of body cladding, there is no structural difference between the Impreza hatch in other world markets and the Crosstrek that we find in America. The takeaway from that is that the Impreza is a compact sedan. It competes very directly with things like the Honda Civic and the Toyota Corolla, so it is definitely on the long side for a subcompact vehicle in America. It's also wider than the average subcompact vehicle. That helps the Crosstrek feel a little bit roomier and a little bit more practical than some of the options. Because Subaru didn't want to design an entirely new vehicle, but they still wanted to be able to compete with the likes of the HR-V, they just decided to make the Crosstrek significantly less expensive, and that makes it a really great value in the Subaru lineup. As we see with most of the Subarus in America, all-wheel drive is standard. You can get a manual transmission if you want to. It's very cargo practical. On the downside, the cargo area is not as large as some of the competition because of that more hatchback-like profile. We get just over 20 cubic feet of storage space, and there are entries in this segment that will give you about 25, some even approach 30. The next very direct competitor in this segment is the Mitsubishi Outlander Sport. Kind of an interesting twist here is that Mitsubishi is of course owned by Nissan now, so we fully expect the next generation Qashqai, Outlander Sport, and Rogue Sport to all be designed on a common platform. But at the moment, there is zero relationship the one to the other. From the front, the Outlander Sport is definitely a handsome alternative. However, as you move around to the side, I think that the overall profile is just a little bit funny. On the other hand, Mitsubishi is giving us a very long powertrain warranty, and that could be important to someone that plans on keeping their car for a little bit longer and is worried about driving around with a CVT. Speaking of CVTs, I'm not really a huge fan of the Mitsubishi CVT. I think that the software programming and the overall gear ratios involved, just the nature of the CVT, the way that it behaves out on the road, is not as good to drive as what we find in the Nissan. Mitsubishi gives us two engines in America. The base engine is pretty weak for this particular segment, considering the Outlander Sport is a little bit larger than some of the ultra-compact crossovers that you might be cross-shopping it with. And if you get the optional 2.4-liter engine, although it gives you a bit more power, I wouldn't exactly call it powerful. You should also know that the Outlander Sport won't give you the same level of active safety technology that we find on the Rogue or a number of the other entries. Forward collision warning, autonomous emergency braking, and blind spot monitoring are not available until the SE trim, which is significantly more expensive than the base model, starting just over $24,000. If my money were on the line in this particular sliver of a segment, if something like a Nissan Kicks is too small for you, but something like a Nissan Rogue is either too big or too expensive to you, then I actually think the Rogue Sport makes a pretty good argument for itself in this category. It's going to be priced more like the average subcompact crossover, but it's going to give you the interior comfort and interior design that you would normally expect in a slightly larger crossover. Now on the downside, the Qashqai on which the Rogue Sport is based is not exactly a spring chicken, very much like the Nissan Rogue. The design is starting to feel a little bit dated, especially when you compare it to some of the newer entries in this segment, like Nissan's own Kicks, which I definitely think looks fresh. Also something like the Hyundai Venue, which was just released for 2020. And then of course we have a solid entry in this group like the Jeep Compass. It will be a little pricey though, keep that in mind. Only really the base models of Compass would be competing with something like the Rogue Sport. The rest of the Compass lineup would be sort of a smaller alternative to the full-size Rogue because of the overall price tag. If I were spending my own money on a smaller crossover right now, I have to say that I would probably step just down into the subcompact category and take a look at something like the Honda HR-V or perhaps a Kia Soul if I didn't need all-wheel drive. However, if you're looking for a new vehicle, you don't want to spend too much money, then I think the Nissan Rogue Sport is a very good second alternative. Although the fuel economy is not going to be as good as some of the smaller crossovers out there, it still gives us relatively decent fuel economy. We have a big cargo area and a big comfortable interior. That really is the big selling point for the Rogue Sport. You'll be able to buy a bigger vehicle for about the same price tag that you would be buying a smaller vehicle with one of the competitor options. But I also have to say that the trouble with being the middle child here is that you could probably get a really screaming deal on a Nissan Rogue, and if that were available, I would probably choose the larger option here. There's nothing wrong with the Rogue Sport per se, I just think that there are also some really good alternatives in this segment and even within Nissan's own lineup. The Nissan Kicks feels very fresh, it's definitely going to be less expensive as long as you don't need all-wheel drive, and then of course the Nissan Rogue is going to give you all-wheel drive and you're probably going to get a screaming deal on it at the dealer lot as well. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and if you were in this really narrow segment taking a look at some of these tweeners that slot between the compact and subcompact crossover segments, what would you look at? Would you get something like the Jeep Compass, even though it is a little on the spendy side? Let me know down there, and I will see you all later.